Neuronal pools. So neuronal pools is a functional groups of neurons that present in the central nervous system, mainly the gray matter, and that process certain information together. Each neuronal pool has its own level of organization and special organization to perform certain function. This figure to appreciate the complexity of the neuronal interactions between these presynaptic neurons 1 and 2 with those postsynaptic neuron A, B, C, D, and so they have different effects because of the different number of synapses on each one of them, and maybe the difference either excitatory or inhibitory effects. Let's say that neuron 1 is excitatory and also neuron 2. Then this is, for example, in neuron 2 is affecting this whole area. This neuronal area that is stimulated by this nerve fiber is called the stimulatory field of neuron 2. And this is the stimulatory field of neuron 1. Each stimulatory field for a nerve fiber have different zones. For example, in the center, because of the highest number of synapses, and so reaching a threshold, it's called the discharge zone. Whereas on the periphery, because less excitation, it's called facilitated zone. If this neuron is inhibitory, then this whole zone is called an inhibitory zone, and the maximum inhibition will be in the center of this zone. Now, how these neurons are interconnected together to perform certain function, we call it neuronal circuits. One of the simplest neuronal circuits in our body is stretch reflex. So a stretch reflex is composed of a sensory neuron that synapses directly with a motor neuron. So it's a one-to-one synapse. A stretch reflex is a spinal reflex with one sensory neuron synaptic with one motor neuron. The sensory receptor is the muscle spindle that detects stretching in the muscle, and the action will be contraction of that muscle to decrease overstretching of this muscle. You may notice here that it's not only the original stretch reflex that's present here as a neuronal circuit. There is another circuit connecting this same sensory neuron with an interneuron that's inhibitory that synapses with a motor neuron. So this is called reciprocal inhibition. So because of the muscles in the limbs, as you know, they work in opposite pairs. They are antagonistic actions. If I have to contract this type of muscle, I have to relax the antagonistic muscle. Therefore, this same signal that's reached to this muscle and led to contraction, it has to send branches and inhibitory signals to the motor neuron affecting the antagonistic muscle. So this muscle will contract, the opposite muscle or the antagonist muscle should relax. This is one of the most common examples of what we call it reciprocal inhibition, which is another type of neuronal circuits. This is an illustration. This is the main excitatory synapse or stretch reflex causing excitation. And here is a branch synapsing with an inhibitory interneuron that results in inhibition. This is reciprocal inhibition. You may notice here that the sensory neuron does not only branch for the main action, the reciprocal inhibition, but also it gives another branch to go to the brain. And this type of circuit, we call it divergence. So this is also an example of divergent circuits. This is again a divergent circuit. Can be within the same tract or can be into multiple tracts. This is an example of divergence into multiple tract. This is the vestibular branch that's taking information about the balance in the inner ear. So this balance in the inner ear information should go to different nuclei, different areas in the brainstem and the spinal cord, so it can coordinate all these types of information together, such as it's important to maintain the balance so we can maintain the movement of the eye for different cranial nerves, movement of our head and neck. It also has to reach to the cerebral cortex for processing and to get perception of the position of our head in relation to space, and so many pathways that it has to diverge into it and send these types of sensory information. Divergence can be important to act as an amplifying process in which an input signals can spread to a large number of neurons or effectors to reach certain function. An example is a motor unit, which is the motor neuron that's supplying several muscle fibers. These all muscle fibers are supplied by the same motor neuron, so they can contract as one unit at the same time, amplifying the signal. On the other hand, there is convergence, which means that signals from multiple inputs can unite to excite a single neuron. This is an important type of summation to summate or to integrate different types of information together. So convergence can be from the single source or can be from many sources. A well-known example of convergence is what the convergence in photoreceptors or rods. So rods is a type of photoreceptors that detect dim light. So very small intensity of light can be detected by this rod. But in order to reach to the central nervous system and produce an action potential in these neurons, they converge together to produce a stronger, to form a summation and a stronger stimulus to activate these neurons so the signal can reach to the central nervous system. Sometimes the central nervous system wants a prolonged action or a prolonged output of discharge. So this happens in the what we call it after discharge pool or circuits. Here an example of the parallel after discharge. So this is the input and it branches into 3 branches. This is a direct communication with the output neuron, and so you can see that the time spent here will be the shortest, so the signal will reach fastest here. Then with this pathway there is 2 other neurons and that will take longer because of the delay of the synaptic transmission, right? Here is another branch with the 3 neurons. So again, a more delay of the same signal without amplification, without divergence, nothing. We call it parallel after discharge. So it uses several changes of neurons, of different numbers of neurons in each one of them, that at the end they will converge on the same output neuron. So each one of these chains will take different time, so they will reach, the signal will be reaching at varying time. And you can see here the lines or the arrows in the same direction. There is no feedback loop, so it's not what we call it reverberatory circuit. Now this reverberatory or oscillatory circuits is very important in the central nervous system. It provides like a positive feedback to re-excite the input of the same circuit. So once stimulated, this circuit may discharge repetitively for a long time because of this circuit. So here is a collateral from this output neuron to the same input neuron as a reverberatory circuit, a simple one. This is a more complex reverberatory circuit. This is even more complex reverberatory circuits with so many other neurons and factors playing a role, whether there will be a facilitation or inhibition or none of them. This graph is just showing the time to fatigue of these reverberatory circuits in the normal stage. It will fatigue at this time. If this circuit is inhibited, of course it will fatigue at an earlier time. But if it's facilitated, because it's more excited, then it will fatigue at a larger or a prolonged time. So reverberation can stop because of fatigue at any point. It will stop this feedback system. This type of of a neuronal circuit, it's called continuous signal output. And this continuous excitation is because of one of two mechanisms. Either because it has a continuous intrinsic neuronal discharge, like similar to the one in the cardiac cells, or it has a continuous reverberatory signals that are resistant to fatigue. This is an example of continuous signalings by the respiratory center in the brain stem, and it's discharging continuously, but the strength, the frequency of stimulation, and the intensity of stimulation is different with the activation of a phrenic nerve, carotid body, stimulation of the carotid body. Neuronal circuits are important to maintain them functioning, but also you want to stabilize the central nervous system. You want to keep it because if there is interaction between different types of neuronal circuits, different integration of these circuits, you have to have some mechanisms to stabilize the central nervous system. And of these mechanisms are the inhibitory circuits or the fatigue of the synapses. Inhibitory circuits are important to prevent excessive spread of signals in the central nervous system, so provide an inhibitory feedback circuits, especially in the sensory pathways. study this figure and try to practice and guess what type of neuronal circuits are these. Thank you and good luck.